Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Climate Law and Governance Day Experts Legal Roundtable on Processing versus Performance, Legal Pathways for Sustainable, Nutritious, and Affordable Food Systems. We are here with an amazing panel, which is chaired by Advocate Mayra Souza and Professor Markus Gehring. The session is being hosted by International Flavors and Fragrance. I'll just briefly introduce the chairs for everyone's reference, and then we can just hand over the floor to both chairs to lead the discussion. Mayra Souza is a Global Trade Policy and Compliance Director with International Flavors and Fragrance. And Professor Markus is a professor of European and International Law at the University of Cambridge. He also serves as a lead counsel for the CISDL and also is a laureate of the Climate Law and Governance Global Leadership Award. So with that note, I'll hand over the floor to both chairs to start the discussion.
Thank you very much, Dimension. So good afternoon all and welcome. It's really my pleasure to open the session on processing versus performance, legal pathways for sustainable, nutritious, and affordable food systems. This discussion comes at an important moment. 10 years after the Paris Agreement, food systems have become a rising topic across COPs, expanding from agriculture to diets, from supply chains to food environments. While the so-called ultra-processed foods, UPFs, don't appear directly as such in COP texts, they are becoming increasingly intrinsically connected to the broader food systems debate, surfacing across negotiations and policy discussions. Within this shift, processed foods spark growing debate. Some arguing that processed-based classifications expose real health and environmental risks. Others warn they overly simplify complex systems, stifle innovation, or ignore affordability. With studies pointing different directions, some deeming processed foods harmful, others pointing to a more nuanced picture when life cycle and sourcing are considered. The need for coherent, holistic regulation is clear. And to guide our conversation today, we will reflect on key questions. How can legal systems evaluate foods based on nutrition profiles, life cycle environmental footprints, and sourcing sustainability rather than processing level alone? What reforms in labeling, marketing, packaging, and financing and claims are needed to empower consumers and prevent greenwashing? How agriculture, trade, procurement, and finance law be realigned to reward nutritious and sustainable food products and ingredients? Before turning to those questions, let me introduce our panel, our speakers for today. So we have Phyllis Markus, who is a Senior Vice President, Regulatory Affairs at IFF. She brings over 2 decades of experience at international intersection of science, law, and policy, advancing regulatory strategies that enable innovation across food, agriculture, and consumer goods sectors. Her career spans leadership roles in global corporations, startups, and government agencies, including the US FDA, Mars, ADM, and Hershey. She also serves as a board member at the Minor Use Foundation, supporting improved crop protection across access for smallholders farmers, and advises the World Food Program Safer Project, where she contributes to advancing food safety and security in humanitarian contexts. Her work reflects a lifelong commitment to science-based, risk-proportionate regulation and equitable market access. Phyllis holds a Juris Doctor from Penn State Dixon School of Law and a Master's in Nutrition from James Madison University. Next, we have Mayra Guggenheim, who is a partner and co-chair of the Food, Drug, and Device Practice at Covington Burling and in Washington, D.C. Her work for a broad range of leading global companies and major trade associations include regulatory advice, advocacy before regulators, courts, and legislative bodies, and strategic counseling in light of overarching public health and nutrition policy considerations. Miriam is ranked in Chambers USA as one of the America's leading food and beverage lawyers. She received her BA from the University of Pennsylvania and her Juris Doctor from the Columbia University School of Law. And last but not least, we have Dr. Khalil Manouf Hegarty, who is the company director at Alexley Hegarty, a consultancy specialized in international trade policy, sustainability standards, and market access strategy across the Asia-Pacific region. He has over 20 years experience in the trade and sustainability policy space and has advised producer associations and governments in multilateral environmental agreements, trade agreements negotiations, and conformity assessment for sustainability standards across the Asia-Pacific region, as well Latin America and Europe. He is also the founder and editor of Palm Oil Monitor, an industry publication on the global vegetable oil trade. Dr. Hegarty graduated with first-class honors from the Monash University in Melbourne. So before we begin, just a quick note. Please feel free to add your questions in the chat at any time. We'll do our best to address them during the Q&A session at the end. And to open our conversation, I would like to invite Professor Gehring to offer initial remarks. Following Professor Gehring's intervention, I will invite our three speakers, Phyllis, Miriam, and Khalil, to share their perspectives on the guiding questions from the angles they know best. Our aim is to foster a rich, multi-perspective dialogue that deepens understanding of how performance-based food governance can drive climate-aligned food systems transformation. And with that, Professor Gehring, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mayra, and it's a real honor to co-chair this panel with you. I fondly remember our very intense discussion at the Baku COP that we had about international trade. And I think when we're talking about sustainable food systems, we need to have an eye on the international dimension. I think modern food systems are integrated supply chains. They happen all over the world. And agriculture sometimes seems to be a little bit the lost element of the climate agenda, right? Integrated food systems working with the agricultural sector is becoming more imperative now that we're moving into a somewhat more carbon constrained world. I think sustainable food systems are possible. Big shout out to my latest PhD student, Cassandra Hayward, just wrote a PhD on the food processing industry in Canada and alignment with the SDGs. There are some really inspiring examples, and I think we need to make this a positive story. It's not about restrictions or limitations. It's about innovation. It's about ingenuity. It's about new ideas that we can bring to the table to achieve much better climate alignment and, in the end, more sustainable trade systems all over the world, right? Because sometimes in the climate community, trade has a very bad reputation. I completely reject that. I think trade, only with a functioning trading system can we achieve the net zero targets. Can we actually achieve some of the sustainable food systems objectives that I think we all want to see happening? And please forgive the legal academic on this call to also highlight that there's a legal dimension to our discussion, right? Agricultural laws have been on the law books since the Middle Ages. We always had rules on, for example, sustainable yield, crop rotation, And of course, these rules need to be adapted to the new climate reality, both from an adaptation, but also from a mitigation point of view. So I very much welcome our discussion this afternoon and look forward to our speakers and our interveners. And of course, to all the people on this call in the webinar, please pose your questions in the Q&A button, as Mayra already highlighted. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Gehring. So with that, I'll pass on the words to Phyllis. Phyllis, please. Thank you.
Thank you. I want to thank the organizers and the hosts of this panel for the opportunity to talk about food on a Friday. I don't know a topic that brings people together better than food. And while I have the privilege to be here and work with scholars and jurists and innovators in food every day, the reality is that anybody can talk knowledgeably about multiple aspects of food. We're all unified in our biological need for it and its cultural and emotional impact on our lives and the lives of people we care about. So the rise of focus on so-called ultra-processed foods seems to be born out of a desire for transparency and understanding what we're eating against the backdrop of what's possible. So whether we're talking about AI or fuel or food, all these kinds of topics of discussion that are at COP this week, we all want to balance what is possible with what is safe and sustainable. And in the case of food, we have an addition. We want to balance it against what's nutritious or what's good for us. I believe that the more recent focus on processing is a symptom of just that, the desire for transparency and understanding against that backdrop of what's possible. If we zoom back out, though, to what is driving the conversation, the desire for nutritious and safe food, the need for affordability and sustainability in the systems, having regulatory and legal reform that fixates just on processing food alone, it will miss the target. So I'd like to discuss the regulatory and legal foundations for food and climate. First, I believe there's a need for any framework to be based in facts, and those facts from science. So good regulatory and legal systems start with a strong factual foundation, foundations that allow for consistency. They start with discovery and science, whether it's a solution or the scrutiny of an ingredient, or a metric like an analysis for safety or sustainability. Everything with a scientific basis, and science is evolving. We know more about materials and how they interact with their environments and our bodies than we ever did in the past. Factual foundation in today's environment requires neutrality for trust, though. So trust would be essential for the continuation of funding research and sharing the science. Neutrality is required for trust. I believe in the strong value and the contribution of industry-funded science. It's been criticized, but it has also been crucial in the advancement of food safety and environmental protection. We would not have the ability to scale climate and food solutions without it, but the public has lost trust. The way to reestablish the trust, again, sits with factual findings and transparency, both in funding and in methodology. This includes transparency for methods of analysis to maximize and share those learnings. And in that way, science has the potential to permeate barriers. It permeates divisions that exist even during times of tense political divide. Methodologies for life cycle assessment apply the same principle. The space to disagree exists in risk management, but it should not exist in risk assessment. Transparency and differentiation between those principles of risk assessment and risk management and the practices and the establishment of laws and regulation for our food systems will provide neutrality required to build trust. Conversely, eroding trust in science will then build any regulatory system or legal system on top of a shaky foundation. And it would then be a dangerous comparison of versions of the truth. Finally, I want to mention the benefit of harmonization. Harmonization is an extension of an established or well-built trust with the basis of facts and science, of course, and a trust that comes from neutrality. Now, trust with one another, state to state. It's beneficial for trade, that the professor just mentioned, and it enhances accessibility. When you look at the mission of harmonization bodies like the Codex Alimentarius, the promotion of global standards aren't only for trade, but their mission is food safety for all. Once those foundations are established and protected, then the legal and regulatory frameworks can be applied. And when you're in industry, you can apply them in many ways. They can be applied in the supply chain. Today, we're seeing an increase in demand for advanced regenerative practices that restore soil health and enhance biodiversity, practices that reduce emissions. And in some markets, the demand for those practices has already been codified into law. These efforts align with global climate goals and demonstrate how industry can operationalize those transitions. People that use regenerative practices want to talk about them. They want legitimacy. It all comes back to the trust. Our customers and consumers want renewable bio-based solutions for the entire food system. It's feed and livestock emissions, transport, packaging, chemical replacements from renewable or plant sources, and not carbon sources. Investors want it too, and we're poised to deliver these things in precise, innovative, and scalable ways. It's applied also in food and manufacturing. This isn't new, it's science, but it's also tradition. We've been advancing and innovating in food for hundreds of years, from the way that we grind and shell to the application of heat to our ability today to design for shelf stability. These allow our customers and our consumers to have access to consistent, affordable, safe, and nutritious food. We're proud of what's possible. We help our customers develop foods that deliver better nutrition and lower environmental impact. It includes technology like those renewable biomaterials that I mentioned and more efficient grain processing. Solutions for the world we live in today and the world of the future. Changing landscapes that include dietary patterns, convenience, tastes, trends, and demand from consumers for accountability in the environment and health aspects on the products that they choose. And lastly, those principles from science-based frameworks should be applied in consumer-facing and affordability contexts. We focus our portfolio on bio-derived ingredients that reduce resilience on resource-intensive inputs. That meets consumer demand for health and sustainability. Consumers want to know if that's real or if it's greenwashing. So we believe in transparency, but sometimes more information is not the only way to provide transparency. Because in a world where we're inundated with a lot of information volume, we support labeling that's meaningful and understandable. We don't support initiatives that would promote confusion or fear in consumers, like some marketing tactics that might use fear to sell or differentiate and attack safe ingredients or processes. We and many of our customers use private certification schemes that go beyond regulation. Some are better than others, but it all traces back to the word I've probably repeated the most in this presentation, which is trust. Consumer demand for transparency about the origins and impact of their food. It all goes back to trust. Confirming that we need legal baseline to reside firmly in facts and science. At the end of the day, the principle we rely on most is mutuality. Mutuality is the key to harnessing innovation the right way, to truly tackle the challenges that face our planet and the citizens of our world. Innovation and regulation require mutuality. Legal frameworks rooted in science and fact, optimized through harmonization, will responsibly foster what is possible. IFF's motto is do more good, and our products exist in the daily lives and food of millions of people. When I go to work, I'm proud of what we make and what we do, and I'm glad to have been invited to discuss this with all of you today because it's kind of dialogue that promotes that mutuality. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Phyllis. And indeed, a word that is stood out, trust. And I see this also in other forums, including like global trade forums where I attend this coming back. Science-based, bio-based, which I think it links perfectly to the COP30 theme this year on bioeconomy and everything, all the discussions that are around this topic this year. So with that, I think is a good segue to hand over to Miriam. Miriam, looking forward to hear your views. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mayra, and it's really a pleasure and an honor to be on this panel. I appreciate the insights of all who have spoken thus far, and again, thank the organizers for the opportunity to participate. Innovation is so exciting, and that has been a key theme of the week and Phyllis's remarks just now. We often do see, though, in many venues, hesitation or suspicion of technology, of manufacturing, of those types of non-natural processes and entities. And we're seeing that, of course, play out in the concern about ultra-processed foods today. But I appreciate the opportunity to speak today about how regulating foods solely on the basis of their degree of processing can have unintended consequences on nutrition and health outcomes, equity and affordability, and the environment and sustainability. And again, I echo what Phyllis has said about the need for an evidence base. We need evidence-based law and regulation. And indeed, in the US, that requirement is enshrined in our law, in our Administrative Procedure Act, which prohibits agency regulations from being arbitrary and capricious. Turning first to nutrition and health outcomes, the key areas of focus from a public health and legal and regulatory perspective should be on the safety and nutritional quality of food, and not just on its degree of processing. Data do not currently establish that the degree of processing alone creates adverse health consequences. To the contrary, it's important to note that many types of processing and formulations are beneficial. The addition of even synthetic nutrients can have significant benefits. And I want to talk about one case study in particular, and that's the folic acid fortification of enriched flour and bread, which has been heralded by the U.S. Centers for Disease Control and Prevention as one of the top public health achievements of the 20th century. And in the 10-year period covering 1996 to 2006, this intervention was responsible for a 36% reduction in neural tube defects and preventing an estimated 10,000 neural tube defect affected pregnancies during the first decade of this current millennium, which resulted in a savings of $4.7 billion in direct costs. So there are many who would consider folic acid fortified enriched flour and enriched bread to be an ultra-processed food, but we must not lose sight of this tremendous public health benefit across the population and the cost savings. And I note that folic acid in this case, it's synthetic. The synthetic form of that nutrient is actually more bioavailable than the folic acid that is found naturally in certain whole foods. And this is true for other vitamins as well. So again, it's important to look at the evidentiary basis and not just take a construct of looking at whether something is processed or man-made as the marker of whether it is helpful for us. Certain processed foods can also help meet nutrient shortfalls, again, with enriched breads and other enriched grain foods in the US accounting for more than 80% of all grains eaten and thus becoming a primary source of dietary fiber. And speaking of fiber, I think FDA's regulation in the US of the definition of dietary fiber is a very good example of a regulatory scheme that considers the degree of processing against an evidentiary basis towards the goal of ultimate public health. So in 2016, FDA implemented a definition of dietary fiber for purposes of nutrition labeling as the non-digestible carbohydrates and lignin that are intrinsic and intact in plants, but also isolated or synthetic non-digestible carbohydrates that FDA determines have a beneficial physiological effect in humans. So we had the naturally sourced intrinsic fibers in plant foods, but also those that may be man-made as long as the evidence showed they had a beneficial physiological effect. FDA created a regulatory scheme for the agency to evaluate that effect and promulgated regulations and guidance to authorize that category of dietary fiber. So this approach addressed the risk of companies indiscriminately adding ingredients and claiming them to be equivalent to the benefits of whole foods, or otherwise not delivering the nutrition benefits that would be expected from dietary fiber and whole foods, while allowing those processed ingredients, when demonstrated by evidence, to be used. So we got nutrition, we got innovation, and we got transparency, and we got communications to consumers that they could trust because it was grounded in evidence with the FDA's oversight. There are other ways that commercially processed foods can help deliver nutrition. For example, they may increase the palatability of otherwise nutritive foods, such as whole grain breads that perhaps children find bitter, or flavored milks. And sugar content in such products can be kept low. That's a function of nutritional composition, not degree of processing. And such foods can also be vehicles for the delivery of other nutritious foods, such as sandwiches with wholesome ingredients in the middle that are easy even for children to make for themselves and for them to take to school in a safe and shelf-stable way. So even if it were shown to be preferable to eat solely or primarily whole, unprocessed foods cooked from scratch at home, this is just not feasible for many families for many reasons, including costs, time, parents working, etc. Processed foods can be lower cost options that can be nutrient dense and offer wholesome nutrition. Added preservatives in processed foods enable foods to stay fresh and wholesome as it's distributed across distances, including to rural or other hard to reach communities, so consumers have access to a wide range of nutritious foods, including in all seasons. And processing in certain established to be safe and effective, it can help keep food fresh even in consumers' homes, avoiding costs associated with spoilage and food waste. And that takes us to considerations about the environment and sustainability. All sorts of types, many types of processing can help prevent food waste by extending the use of various components of food, ensuring it can travel distance without degradation, and keeping the food fresh even in consumers' homes. So as we consider the debate around ultra-processed foods, I think we have 4 key takeaway messages. First is that a singular focus on the degree of processing can cause policymakers to lose focus on broader issues of nutritional composition, health outcomes, equity, affordability, and sustainability. A broader lens should be the overall wholesomeness of food products along with their affordability and accessibility. This isn't to say we sacrifice nutritional quality for cost. Rather, we focus on how to deliver good nutrition to the broadest possible population. So in sum, public health policy should promote nutrient-dense foods and diets in an evidence-based manner, rather than focusing solely on processing as a measure of healthfulness. Doing so can maximize nutrition and broader public health outcomes in a manner that promotes affordability, transparency, and equity. Thank you. Back to you, Mayra.
Thank you so much, Miriam. Amazing for the practical examples that could really illustrate how this all comes together. Thank you so much. I will now go to Khalil, who is also international trade policy like me, so things crossing borders. I'm looking forward to hear from you, Khalil, as well, your views on the topic. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mayra, and thank you, Professor Markus. Thanks, Miriam and Phyllis, for some great comments and really, really strong insights there. It's good to be speaking at a COP again, albeit virtually. I feel like a bit of a veteran. The first one I went to was way back in 2007, which seems like a very long time ago now. It's interesting though observing how even after almost 2 decades, some of the things really haven't changed. And to me, the big thing at COPs and you know, particularly across the sustainability debate, are always at consistent tension. So say, for example, like my background is in forestry and agriculture. The focus at the COPs was always that consistent tension between deforestation and food production. You know, what level of deforestation is acceptable to produce food? Talk to some people, apparently it's zero. Of course, we realize that that's completely impractical. We see a very similar tension in the trade debate as well, just to move on to what Professor Markus was starting out before. Okay, what level of food importation is acceptable in the contemporary modern economy? Again, some people say as little as possible. Some people say, well, obviously we have a growing population. We need to import more. The structure of our economy has changed. We're concentrating on different things. We're a services-based economy. We need to import more agricultural produce or processed foods. Now, that obviously sort of manifests itself in different frameworks across the world. Just sort of diving into that sort of legal governance aspect, you can see that as well, particularly in the tensions between the governance frameworks or the institutions of, say, the WTO versus the MEAs. And there's a constant pressure, or there has been in the past, just this constant pressure from various stakeholders to have the WTO being more active on sustainability matters. And, you know, if you talk to the purists, we have this tendency to say, no. We've really, the WTO and trade professionals, we've got to stick to our knitting. What do? We help move goods across borders. And that's what we should be doing. All of these other things, whether it's health, whether it's sustainability, they're not really our concern. Now, obviously, the practicalities of that aren't feasible either, because we are stakeholders in this debate as well. And we might try and say, well, you know, I only really deal with customs and compliance. Well, actually, you do, but everything you do has a ripple effect somewhere else. So just with that in mind, moving that sort of idea of having those tensions across to the nutrition versus affordability aspect as well, which is really entering everything that we've heard from Phyllis, from Miriam, from Markus so far, and particularly Miriam, you really spoke about that really well. And with that, I'll move on to my area of expertise, because it's a good case study, which is the Indonesian agricultural sector, and particularly palm oil. Now, I've worked with the palm oil sector and also the forestry sector across Southeast Asia for close to 20 years now. Obviously, the deforestation part of that has always been the focus. But things are changing, and they've changed quite a lot, particularly on the deforestation side. The industry has done a very impressive job of changing its practices, et cetera. Some of that is, it's 2 steps forward, 1 step back often. You know, say, for example, Malaysia has reduced its deforestation rates. So has Indonesia. Other countries, not so great. But now, what's becoming really interesting in that space and seeing it move into the nutrition and UPF ultra-processed food debate is palm oil as an ingredient for domestic food manufacturing and also supply in Indonesia. Indonesia still has many problems in terms of just the basics, in terms of feeding its population. So say, for example, stunting still a problem, which is unusual to hear, obviously in the West, but we think of it, and obviously in the developing world it's a bit more common, but with an economy the size of Indonesia's, how is this still the case? Now, that has prompted the current president to launch a school lunches program. He has been sort of taken a lot of criticism for doing this, but at the same time, somebody needed to take the reins and try and address this problem of stunting among school children. Now, the thing about palm oil in this instance is that, as we know, it is a very, very key ingredient in ultra-processed food, probably the basis of a lot of things that people have criticised, whether that's sort of muesli bars, cookies, etc., etc., etc. Now, the thing about palm oil, which was a real game changer for manufactured food around the world, is that aspect of shelf stability. And that has completely changed the world of baked goods. It has completely changed how food is stored, shelf life, transport. Now, in the West, makes a lot of sense. Oreos are everywhere and Oreos are full of palm oil. Now, let's take that example of an ultra-processed food. We could say Oreos, but let's try and just say shelf-stable packaged bread, and put that into the school lunches program in Indonesia. Why would this be important? Well, Indonesia does not have cold chain storage across the entire country. In fact, it's pretty rare. So how do you mass produce school lunches, distribute them across a country that literally consists of more than 17,000 islands, and make that affordable and make it nutritious? Okay, so that is unfortunately just the starting point. Now, imagine somebody has this great idea of setting up some sort of framework or international standard for ultra processed foods and says, okay, this is going to be the standard. This is an extreme example, obviously, but let's say they've said, all right, here's our definition of UPFs, and this can't be considered healthy. Now, imagine trying to impose that on a situation in Indonesia where they are in the process of establishing just the very basics of getting a bunch of school kids nutritional meals every day. It's going to be very, very difficult. I'm a firm believer in international standards and using standards infrastructure. And one of the things that I really like about that is the way those standards are developed and the standards development take place, and ensuring that all stakeholders have an input from the ground up, and ensuring that those sort of standard development processes that are internationally accepted and really successful in terms of whether it's food safety standards, product safety standards, et cetera, can really make a difference to people's lives in ways that we often don't see. And I think if we are going to try and sort of have a coherent and sensible debate about ultra-processed foods, it's, like you say, got to really follow a pattern that is trusted and standards development, and getting that consensus among all the stakeholders, whether it's cross industry, public health advocates, sustainability advocates, but most importantly, the people who actually need the food and can tell you whether it's going to bust their family budget or not. but I think, again, gets back to trust, as you've all said so far, and we need to be able to listen to each other when it comes to these things. So I'll hand it back to Mayra, and I look forward to more of a discussion.
Thank you so much, Agarthe. So I understood that although you're based in Melbourne, you are right now in Indonesia, which is 2 a.m. I just checked. So wow, thank you very much for joining us. Really appreciate
I'm
it.
actually in Australia, so it's okay. It's 6 a.m. It's not too bad.
Okay, still, but anyway, so thank you for joining us, and then also sharing this overview coming from the Asia Pacific as well, and especially when you mention like palm oil. I mean, it's just like on the spotlight everywhere now, indeed, because of deforestation, certifications, all the standards, and so on. So I really love the example. So thank you. What I will turn now is to all speakers and also Professor Gehring to give you some time and opportunity to react in any one of the previous interventions, that maybe if you want to add some comments on what has been said before I turn to a few questions. Yes, Phyllis, go ahead.
Thank you so much. I've really enjoyed the last intervention specifically related to palm as somebody that studied nutrition, but also as somebody that works a lot with what could be possible with technology like precision fermentation. And I really liked what you said about shelf stability. And I think when we look at these ingredients and the why behind them, palm was never selected because people wanted deforestation. Palm was selected for its properties. And when we look at what's possible in food technology, with the ability to potentially scale up something that has similar properties to palm or even a palm equivalent, using renewable feedstocks, using different inputs and making available that shelf stability. Although as a nutrition person, maybe also having a look at, are there other fats and oils with palm similarities and characteristics that also have better health outcomes as well. So I really like the example because at the end, it's not about the ingredient or even in some ways the process by which we derived the ingredient that makes it so-called ultra processed, or it's the use of it, it's the manufacturing of it, and the application of it, how it's actually presented. So these big, well-intended movements to characterize one thing one way in a very diverse global environment are challenging. And I think exactly what you said at the end, which is that we have to talk to each other. We have to listen to how our assumptions from where we live and what we see impact places that we've not seen and we didn't understand. So thank you for that.
Thank you, Phyllis. Any other comments? Otherwise, I'll turn to questions. Okay, so Phyllis, go ahead.
Quickly, thanks to you both as well for those comments about particularly on nutritional labeling, because I mean, I don't know what it's like in the rest of the world, but certainly here, I mean, there is this constant push for more information and transparency, but the usefulness of that is often overlooked. And I think, Phyllis, that gets back to your last point as well, which is, you know, we're often thinking about sort of a very narrow set of parameters where, yeah, okay, great, we've got to have transparency, we've got to have all this information. But, you know, to me, because I'm not a nutrition person, I just look at a lot of these things and it's completely meaningless. Like, legitimately. I just don't understand things I'm reading. So I look at the carbs and then go. but yeah, it's and I think that again gets back to what you both said, which is just about the complexity of what we're doing. And a lot of the time I think we still haven't really got our heads around that, and we don't really see. Like if we'll put it this way, if the five of us here can have a lot of trouble understanding these things, then it's going to be difficult for everyone else.
If I could pick up on that a bit, I completely agree with you about the degree of confusion, and I think we need our global and regional and countrywide regulators or public health bodies to do a better job of being the leading voice in nutrition education. So in the US, the law that established the requirement to have nutrition labeling on our foods is called the Nutrition Labeling and Education Act of 1990. And it's long been said that FDA never implemented the "and education" piece of that statutory title. We got this nice box with lots of information and percentage DVs, and we never taught consumers how to use that. And when the government entity isn't the credible voice, coming back to the point about trust and credibility, we have so much noise coming from so many different directions. So we really need that evidentiary base, the courage by the regulators to dig in, to try to get to the truth as best they can, and to be the authoritative and leading voice in educating consumers.
Thank you, Miriam. And I will just build up on that, on a question to Phyllis, but whoever would like also to jump in. Exactly on this point, like how can regulators and industry collaborate to create frameworks that balance innovation with public trust, call for transparency, without oversimplifying complex issues like processing? So it's open, or Phyllis, if you also want to address, anyway.
I think sometimes the goal starts out with simplification, and then it just gets compounded with like one more good idea or one more thing. And by the end of it, like similar to what Miriam was saying, we lose the North Star. So I often like to start with that good intent and then remember that we have to zoom back out to it at the end of it. When I was mentioning about, transparency, I love transparency. I think it's really crucial that we are able to talk about our methods, our funding, our biases, our, why the rules exist the way that they do. But without the education part, without people understanding, and with the volume increasing every day of information at our fingertips, like sometimes less is more. Sometimes regulation can reduce some of that noise as well, right? So when I see so much, regulatory people and marketing people aren't always made of the same stuff, but I see so much marketing that makes me just baffled in the grocery store, because it's claiming things like no fat on something that would never have fat in it to begin with, or just, there's a lot of information out there, and it's used to the advantage of in the marketplace, and a short-term advantage that can confuse consumers. So I don't always think more is more. I think that we have to remember why, when we ask a regulator to tackle an issue, what the end goal is for public health, for consumers, for the environment. And if it starts to get muddled, maybe pulling back can sometimes be more than adding on.
Thank you, Phyllis. So the next question, I will put it to Khalil, so Hugarty. Since you mentioned about the WTO, and then also the nexus with climate trade, it reminded me what is going on right now at COP30 in Berlin. First of all, there was a proposal to create a forum linking trade and climate, right? Discussions. So the UNFC, CCC, and WTO. And as far as understood, it was also in the presidency for consultations on a work program, joint work program, and so on. So would you think that would be also a space where not only, I mean, beyond all the classical topics that we're talking about now, carbon border measures and so on, that could be also a space for food systems, because there are other strains, right? We see, I was checking also the documents on the Sharm el-Sheikh work program that address food security and so on. But would you see that also as a venue for those discussions as well related to food systems? Thank you.
Thanks. That is, I wasn't actually aware of that, so that's good. I mean, I haven't been paying attention to the COP this year. There's always a lot of pages, documents that having a year off is actually quite nice.
But even like what I would say, like this intent.
No.
I
do actually think, the cynic in me might actually say, well, that's a good place to put all of these things so these institutions don't have to deal with them on their own. But in terms of whether it's actually useful, being really, really honest, I think this goes back to what Phyllis was saying as well, which is you kind of don't want to put too many things in the basket. That's sort of putting a hat on a hat, so to speak. And you do have to be careful of that sort of mission creep where everybody gets their say, but then nothing gets done. I think some of the more interesting work around that has actually been, largely the technical work being done by the FAO, more than anywhere else. And apologies, I'm not really up to date with the current sort of institutional linkages between the UNFCCC and the FAO. But that has always struck me as being the sort of probably the best fit. I mean, obviously the trade aspect is less in there, but I don't think it's particularly deniable. And if we're talking about the end use of it, I mean, I have a lot of bias towards the FAO because I always just have thought that generally in this environment they've kept the most level head in the sustainability debate, and really sort of tried to ensure that everyone's perspectives are really balanced. So, not knowing enough about it, I do worry about duplication. And I think this gets back to some of the things that we've said before, which is like, do we need more? Maybe all of the institutional infrastructure that we already have is actually really good, and there are some things that are already working very well.
Thank you, and apologies for getting also surprised then on the question. But I think your reflection perfectly is aligned to what I have also read. There were some similar reactions as well from different parties, like, do we need really that in there? So I think you're good. Thank you for that, Khalil. So I have a following question then, that would be for Miriam. How can laws ensure transparency and neutrality in food risk assessments while still allowing companies to innovate? Any specific examples you have come across that you would point as guideposts? Thank you.
Thank you. That's an excellent question. And I'm going to try to answer on a global basis while also using certain US legal constructs as a touch point. I do think that regulators and government enforcement bodies should be authorized to enforce against deceptive and misleading communications. Now, in the United States, we have a First Amendment that protects truthful and not misleading speech, even by corporations. So that gives a balance that creates a lot of opportunity. It also creates uncertainty. So we do have the ability to communicate. It's got to be truthful. We have, again, in the US, many stakeholders who are looking at communication. So we have what I would call enforcement, not just by regulatory authorities, but by private parties as well, that will bring lawsuits for unlawful or unsubstantiated or misleading claims. And I think that's not a bad thing because, again, while there's less certainty than in jurisdictions that have a positive claims list, for example, there's the opportunity to communicate in a way that may have more marketing relevance directly to consumers, because it is companies who market food to people who know best how to convey those messages. So I think a lot of opportunities could be lost if messages can only be made in very prescriptive language. That said, there needs to be sort of the checks and balances to make sure that that communications are substantiated by evidence in the appropriate lane. So for example, in the US, foods cannot claim to prevent, treat, or mitigate disease, even if there's evidence that they would do so. That's just not appropriate for food companies. So I think there's sort of a push-pull, but if we have a strong system with evidence at its root, and we have stakeholders, be they public or private or both, that are overseeing the marketing communications, in my view, that's almost the best of all worlds. Adding onto that an educated consumer base. So we need that piece as well.
Thank you, Miriam. So I will just open again and see if there are any other reactions or questions or comments. Also, Professor Gehring, if you have anything to add.
Yeah, no, I also teach European law, and there were some sort of a start of a discussion. I think that is something to watch out for. If eventually the CBAM extends to agriculture, there will be enormous political pressure to also then think about the trade dimension, maybe the border carbon adjustment kind of questions. On the other hand, we've seen these massive trade disruptions, and we have colleagues from the US on this call, but the trade deals, so to speak, that the US has just signed with Switzerland, with Central American countries, in my view, are really problematic from an international trade point of view, because they don't actually facilitate trade with the US. They're creating new barriers. And I think that is something, especially for food systems, we need to watch out for. Sometimes we tend to forget, or members of the climate community tend to forget, that the SDGs actually start with zero hunger and no poverty, right? Hunger is still a reality, and maybe we can sort of put one of the Q&A questions that our lovely audience has asked to the panel, because I think how can innovative food systems and healthy food systems also address the number one human rights issue, which is global hunger. That is perhaps one of the first questions, and it sort of gels well with the question that was asked, or the series of questions that were asked by Ruby Critics from Zambia, who's a Zambia global climate champion, and she was asking how food has continued to be scarce for many poor countries, but the cost of production makes it more expensive to afford. So how can we make sure food becomes affordable?
Thank you, Markus. So does any of you would like to address this question from Ruby?
I can make a start. I don't know if it'll completely address the question, but I think in specific solutions with what I do that are not the full gambit of what is possible, but I'll starting with agricultural productivity and local sourcing, moving into cost-efficient formulation, really looking at resilient supply chains. I think there are aspects in those places that contribute to addressing the affordability question that Ruby asked about the food continues to be scarce in many countries, and the cost of production makes it more expensive. So, and those solutions that I'm talking about are things that are also climate forward. So encouraging soil health, crop rotation, some of that regenerative agriculture, not just products, but also practices. And the less reliance that there is on expensive synthetic inputs, that contributes to bringing down that cost of production, climate smart practices. But in a very, very different part of the food chain, other technologies like flavor modulation, when we're talking about crops that are scarce or that put a lot of pressure. We talked about palm already, but cocoa and sugar, where you can reduce without sacrificing the things that people are looking for. There are technologies there that sort of stretch what we have further, and then that has ripple effects into the supply chain. Those are things that can be inserted in various places without it being one, brilliant legal fix or one brilliant regulatory fix that's going to save the day. I think really the reality is that it will be many lights going on along that supply chain to contribute to the betterment of the world in that way, and the availability of food and lowering of cost production.
Thank you, Phyllis. So I'm just putting the question to our colleague, Hayden, who is also online. Hayden, are you coming in, talking to us as well? Any comments to add?
Thank you, Mayra. I appreciate it. And wonderful to be speaking to everybody here today. I just wanna echo the points that Phyllis says. I'm just here to support the conversation. So thank you.
No worries, but thank you for joining and helping us with the session.
I think is just on Professor Markus's question about how can innovative food systems address hunger. That is such a great question, and it's absolutely enormous. It's like one of the reasons that I want to respond to this is that I remember years ago, about a decade ago, everyone was always talking about disruptive technologies, and you've got to be a disruptor, and you've got to but is it disruptive? And this one can't remember who it was. They made this really good comment, which was, well, actually, I think the most disruptive technology of the past 100 years is actually the refrigerator. And they went on to describe, you know, exactly what the household refrigerator had done to food production, logistics, people's incomes, household disposable income, nutrition, public health outcomes in terms of, you know, reducing disease, food poisoning, etc., etc. I thought, wow, what a great comment. And Markus, obviously, this isn't going to answer your question, because if I did have an answer to it, you know, maybe I'd be doing bigger things. But, you know, perhaps in that regard, it's not necessarily something we're looking for. Like, it could just be something that's completely out of the box, which is, and I think, Phyllis, this gets back to what you're saying as well, which is that, you know, we might, I mean, we do have to look everywhere, but it's not necessarily, it could be the most counterintuitive thing that we come across. Like, you know, obviously we're really trying to move, you know, there's such a movement towards all of these healthy eating practices, etc., etc. But, you know, look, I mean, maybe just being a bit optimistic, and it's early here, but it could just be staring us right in the face and we don't actually know what it is. And it could just be needing to take something that already exists and exemplifying that, and trying to bring it back to that idea of ultra processed foods. That, you know, obviously we've got such a bias against processing now, that it's been very easy for us to latch on to this idea that processing equals bad, whereas we kind of need to work against that bias. I mean, I'm not trying to say, oh yeah, processing is amazing, we should all just be eating processed food. I'm just more trying to say we need to, like, that bias that we have against it, and that has sort of become inherent and just become common sense, is possibly going to be a big roadblock going forward. And again, this comes back to the communications thing as well, which is like, okay, well, so how do we've managed to get this ingrained point of view, which has developed over the past 20 years, because before that it wasn't there, right? Like, this idea of processed food being bad, you know, well, let's say 30 years, like, because everyone was eating Campbell's soups and whatever, and it was all fine, and we all smoked cigarettes. But now we've really sort of moved to this sort of instant reaction, which is processed equals bad. And maybe if we're just constantly going into the debate with that bias, we're going to overlook something which is potentially very good and very meaningful. Sorry, that was me just sort of thinking out loud in response to Markus's question, because it was such a great question. I'll be quiet.
Love it. No, thank you. Brilliant. So I will put a final question, and then we'll go afterwards to see if there is any final comments, and then to close the session. So linked to Philly's key points on mutuality and trust amongst across all stakeholders, how can we speed up global safety harmonization without limiting local control or creating trade barriers for developing countries?
Sorry,
Right. If you have any comments, also go ahead. Don't hesitate.
I'm sorry, Mayra. I actually lost sound for part of that.
Yes, go ahead.
No, I lost sound for part of it, so I didn't fully hear.
Yeah, okay. So how can we speed up global safety harmonization without limiting local control or creating trade barriers for developing countries?
It's a good question. I think because it does start at the local level. As I was mentioning that like build toward harmonization. Harmonization is the cherry on the top, right? And it can only be done once you have that science-based, fact-based basis. And then you have regulations and law established in that. Then you get together for hopefully consensus. I mentioned Codex Alimentarius, which I have extremely high regard for, but everyone I would say admits is quite a slow body based on resource and just the difficulty to get truly global consensus. I think national governments have also the options of regional approaches toward harmonization. And most of the time, the harmonization system sort of sorts a lot of those things out, right? So if you have countries that don't understand why certain usage of a pesticide is in place in a different climate, the country with the different climate is going to tell you why they need that for addressing the pests that plague their crop. And so some of that consensus work that gets done in bodies like Codex or even regional bodies is really reliant on the facts and the sharing of aspects of geography or crop production that are distinct in that country. So you're going to find, for example, Italy has very strong feelings about dairy, and Indonesia has very strong feelings about palm, or some countries with aflatoxin, or even heavy metals where there's uptake in, places where there's high volcanic activity in soil. And so you see these safety standards get established based on the facts and also the diversity of the regions, and then they come together for consensus. And it's why, I'm a free trade person, so it's why the bodies that were doing the sanitary, phytosanitary agreements and the technical barrier to trade agreements would point to these scientific bodies to help settle disputes. So they're not there to settle the dispute. They're there to bring the facts for the system, facts that can be trusted and that are aligned with consensus, and push them into the legal and regulatory frameworks and hopefully get more harmonization than less. So that then fosters free trade because they're based in ultimately like the safety rather than and consensus rather than the differences. They often don't agree, often on things like labeling, where populations are extremely different, or they consume foods at different rates or understand labels differently. But you will see on the fundamentals of food safety that they'll agree on things like limits for aflatoxin, because some of those are rooted in toxicology, microbiology. And so you can get consensus on some of those baseline things that can foster trade, even if it's not everything.
Thank you, Phyllis. And I really I'm so biased because as a trade person, I love the trade word is coming back sometimes. So thank you for that. We are actually about time. I'm not sure if I can take an additional question, Professor Gehring.
Yeah, we are almost out of time. We can go ever so slightly over. There is there was a question from one of our colleagues here, Andrea, who asked about a discussion on the educated consumer base and regulators educating consumers. How do you have any thoughts on food education and food justice in schools and local communities? Maybe very briefly, it would be great to get your thoughts on this. And I think at least Phyllis and Miriam already sort of half addressed this issue, right? Education and an educated consumer base is definitely needed also for the net zero transition.
I'm happy to follow up on this briefly. I do think it's really important. When I grew up in school, we actually did have nutrition education in the very lower grades. I believe that has been taken out of the curriculum as not, sophisticated enough or at the expense of other types of education. But this is so fundamental. Health is the beginning of everything. And particularly for children, to form good habits, to understand why they should be eating certain foods. I do think it's something that they can learn, and I would love to see that brought back into the curriculum for children at a young age when they're forming their preferences, when there are plenty of very tasty, nutritious foods that it's really important to expose them to. I think it can be part of school meal programs that are happening during the course of the day as well. While some of this requires funding, I ultimately don't think it requires all that much. It can be part of a natural conversation. Again, it does depend on aligning on the fundamentals and the principles. If we're having fundamental disagreements about whether it's the degree of processing or the nutrient composition that make foods healthful, then it's harder to do that education without consensus. So again, I do think we need to have strong leadership and clear principles that then are very easy to filter down.
Thank you, Miriam. So any other reactions or any then final remarks before I close the session? Just around any other final comments?
No, just to thank you all for participating in Climate Law and Governance Day. It's really important on a day like today, where in Belém we're discussing the trade and climate change nexus. That nexus is very diverse, and it's not a one-way street or just a one-way friendship. It goes both ways, and we need a much more sophisticated, educated discussion about international trade and climate change at this particular COP, but then also with the potential of creating a forum discussing the linkages going forward. More and more trade agreements see climate change as an essential element. And so we will see more interpretations of existing trade agreements that also take climate change into account. I think we all need to be prepared for that new reality. And, the more we can create resilient food systems all over the world, the better we're achieving the Sustainable Development Goals, including zero hunger, no poverty, human health, sustainable consumption, etc. So thank you again, Mayra, for your leadership. And thank you to all the panelists. Mayra, if you close us off. And I should make a quick announcement for those who are in the webinar. There is a short break now in our program as the next high-level panel has been postponed to 2026. And so we'll start with the closing at 5:30 Belém time. That's 8:30 UK time. Thank you,
Professor Gehring. Now, I will just add a few comments from my notes throughout the panel. So first of all, thank you to Professor Gehring and then our panelists for the wonderful conversation today. I personally enjoyed. And as we have discussed, food law must evolve into frameworks that reward indeed nutritional sustainability and equity. Innovation and governance can work hand in hand to accelerate climate-aligned food system transformation and reach our shared goal of a safe, secure, and accessible food supply for all. And how do we get there? From what we saw here and that has been mentioned, the bioeconomy principles that we can also take into food regulation, so the bio-based solutions, creating incentives for regenerative sourcing, bio-based innovation, as I just mentioned, and circular design. These frameworks must balance climate ambition with affordability and inclusion, that we repeat throughout the panel several times, ensuring that progress strengthens rather than strengthens communities. And I think that's the point of Rogati, who made it about Indonesia. So performance-based regulation can shift the focus towards nutritious food and innovative processing design while safeguarding universal access. Because a truly sustainable food system is one that serves everyone and leaves no one behind. So bringing this perspective into COP30, future COP agendas, or a forum linked to trade or not, and beyond, can help sharpen the focus on outcomes-based food policy. By focusing on performance, we can have better climate-aligned food governance, as I mentioned, that deliver real benefits for people, planet, and the future of our food systems. So with that, I would like to thank you again, and see you soon.
Thank you, everyone.